Hi, everyone. I'm Tracy Butcher, the Director of Outreach for Wildlands Network. Many of you know me, but for those who don't, I'm based in Cocoa, Florida. I have been with Wildlands Network for 13 years as a lead in the organization's fundraising efforts, outreach, and organizational growth. This is one of the best turnouts we've had for our webinar series, so I'm really pleased to have you all here with us today. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedule, and I hope you enjoy our talk about the politics of wildways. I'm going to introduce Susan Holmes for you right now. She is our policy director. She's been long passionate about protecting wildlands and wildlife and combines a love of advocacy with expertise in media, government, and the workings on Capitol Hill. For Wildlands Network, Susan leads a coalition of national organizations stewarding national corridor legislation. The Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is being reintroduced this year into the House with bipartisan support. The bill will address protections for native species, their habitat, incorporate wildlife connectivity into federal climate strategies, and mitigate wildlife vehicle collisions. She's also working with our policy team in Seattle on state connectivity legislation and coordinates our connectivity policy coalition. Before coming to Wildlands Network, Susan developed environmental programs at Columbia University and went on to work with the Sierra Club, where she campaigned to protect the Great Bear Rainforest, the Adirondacks, and other wild places. Her impressive resume also includes a decade-long stint as senior legislative representative for Earth Justice and the Washington, D.C. representative for Save the Wild Salmon Coalition. She lives steps from the hill in Washington, D.C. with her two daughters, her husband, who is a fellow environmentalist, and a very spunky terrier. So before I hand over to Susan, I just wanted to let you know that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them in the question box located on your dashboard. Typically, that's on the right side of your screen. After the presentation, we'll address questions queued in the dashboard, and if there's time, we'll open the floor for discussion. So without further ado, I will hand over to Susan now as she opens the curtain for a peek at how policy is translating Wildlands Network's vision into a reality.
Thank you, Tracy, so much for that really generous introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. And I'm so excited to be talking to you about really one of the most, in my career, one of the most exceptional things that I've worked on, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, as well as some of the state initiatives that we're planning and working on at the Wildlands Network. At a time when there's a lot of bad news out there on biodiversity and conservation, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is truly one of the few hopeful and proactive solutions that we see on the forefront. And it's exciting congressional leaders in Washington, D.C., as well as the public. The Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is really, as Tracy was saying, the Wildlands Network vision manifested in policy. And the exciting thing is it has the potential to protect wildlife on a scale that we need right now. We hear a lot about the sixth grade extinction and all the challenges of biodiversity loss, but the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is truly hopeful, truly proactive, and truly exciting to be working on. So thank you so much for joining us. I want to start with the vision because, as Tracy was saying, this bill really is about our vision and taking this vision to the policy level. So the Wildlands Network was founded nearly 30 years ago by conservation biologists Michael Soule, Reed Noss, as well as the activist Dave Foreman. And they combined the science with the advocacy to come up with this vision and the mission that you have before you to reconnect, restore, and rewild North America so that life in all its diversity can thrive. And that was indeed a fairly radical idea at the time. Not so much now. The science has really forward on this, and many of the ideas that were new and on the cutting edge for 30 years ago are now widely accepted. And it's largely because of the work of the Wildlands Network that we're there now. Let's take you down to the 3 C's. So let me start with the 3 C's. This is the heart of what we do at the Wildlands Network, and it's about protecting core habitats, carnivores, and corridors. And when we talk about core habitats, we're talking about the large wild areas that are big enough to protect a whole diversity of species, particularly the large wide-ranging carnivores like wolves, jaguar. This picture is of the Northern Jaguar Preserve in Mexico, and it links as part of our spine of the continent, which is really one of the great wild areas in North America, and still protects and supports the whole, really a range of species, including many of the species that Lewis and Clark saw when they first encountered these landscapes many years ago, from the wolf to the grizzly, etc. So those are the cores, the heart and soul of where our biodiversity now resides. And then secondly, we have the carnivores. And I had to choose the wolverine because this is our logo. It happens to be the wolverine. It's one of my own and my husband's favorite species out there, and truly an iconic and very rare example of the carnivores that we protect at the Wildlands Network. But the role of carnivores is very, very important to our mission and to our work. Scientists have found, and maybe the Yellowstone story is the most well-known example of this, that when you have the top carnivores, the top predators in the environment, that environment overall is much healthier and supports a wider range of biodiversity. In Yellowstone, for example, when they brought the wolves back, you could see that the elk and the other species that were overgrazing were not able to do that. They had to move around. They were a little nervous around the wolves. And so willows came back, and with the willows came the fish and the songbirds. So we believe that carnivores are a key part to the work that we do. And third, sorry, I'm moving ahead. Third are the corridors, which is really where I'm going to be spending most of our time today. Wildlife corridors are those landscapes that connect up these core habitats. They're critical for climate change and for moving species across the landscape. And here you see a great slide of one of the 4 overpasses that's in Banff National Park in Canada. And you can see that Banff, the park is bisected by the Trans-Canada Highway, and was a real challenge for biodiversity, and many species were getting lost in terms as far as roadkill. But with putting and connecting those 2 landscapes across the highway and putting these overpasses in, there's been a reduction by almost 80% of the road mortality of species. And in the last 17 years, nearly 200,000 animals have been documented crossing these wildlife overpasses, including the wolverine, which is quite amazing, as well as wolves and grizzlies and elk, and the whole range of species that are important in that, or a whole range of species that are important in that ecosystem. So corridors, absolutely fundamental, key to how we protect our biodiversity and wildlife. So here's the grand vision that we have come up with based on the science of connecting landscapes. And we have our major wildways, and as I said, the spine of the continent, or our western wildway, is the wildway that goes from the Sonoran all the way up through Canada and up to Alaska. And then we have our eastern wildway, starting in Florida and up to the Gaspé Peninsula in Canada again. And now more recently, and we just rolled out our Pacific Wildway. So we have our Seattle offices now working hard on that part of our grand vision. But we believe if we can protect these areas for biodiversity and connect them up, we'll be able to protect a large part of the North American biodiversity. So what does that look, taking it down to the next level? Here's the Eastern Wildway, and this is a fantastic map that was done by our lead biologist, Ron Sutherland, based in our North Carolina office. And you can see the red is the Appalachian Trail Corridor, and the green areas are those core areas that harbor the biodiversity and are sort of the core areas that are largely, in many cases, already protected, or national forests or parks or reserves or land trusts. And then connecting those cores we have the corridors, and those are the yellow areas. And so you can see this landscape, how it would look if we can protect the cores and the corridors for biodiversity. Excuse me. Sorry, take a little sip. So this landscape just incidentally also happens to reflect E.O. Wilson's half-Earth vision. If you take the corridors and the cores together, it does roughly equal to half of the area that we need to protect for biodiversity. And E.O. Wilson believes that if we can protect half of the planet for biodiversity, then we can protect 80% of our biodiversity. So it's a science-based vision. That's very, very exciting. I want to talk about taking it down just one more level and highlight one of the corridors that the Wildlands Network has been working on in our Southwest office. Here you see our good friend, the lobo, the Mexican wolf, and there are only about 115 of these Mexican wolves in the wild. And it's a species that needs to range, it needs to move, it needs to connect its populations. And so we've come up with this map. This is what a corridor for wolves as well as other species would look like, running from Arizona to New Mexico. And you can see the core areas in the Gila and the Aldo Leopold down in the southern part of your map, and then up more in the north, you can see the wilderness areas and the national forest that this corridor would connect. So we believe if we can connect, again, these places for species like the Mexican wolf, that we can restore and rewild our landscapes. So what does this all mean for the bill and the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act? I'd like to just sort of pivot to talking about the bill again as a manifestation of this vision. The National Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would create a system of wildlife corridors, and it would allow us to protect these corridors that link these core areas. As I said, the vision of this legislation is very forward-thinking, and it has a scale that is commensurate with the challenges of protecting biodiversity. And you might ask yourself, well, why would we think about doing such an ambitious bill at this time? And truly, it is, daunting when you see the attacks on the Endangered Species Act, the attacks on wilderness areas, and indeed what this administration has been doing vis-a-vis wildlife. And you think, we should just be defending what we have. Why are we bothering going out there to take on something that is this ambitious? But in fact, what I've found in talking about this legislation is that maybe particularly because this is such a difficult environment, this legislation has absolutely caught on like wildfire. It is truly one of the things that I think gives people hope that even in a time when things are tough legislatively and difficult on a conservation standpoint, that there is something that we can do, that there are solutions out there, and it gives people a sense of engagement and hopefulness that has been empowering, I think, both to members of Congress and to the public alike. So specifically, I think the time is right for wildlife corridor legislation because it does give members of Congress something to be for, an agenda, a powerful, positive vision that they can hold out there. Secondly, because we are getting bipartisan support for wildlife corridors all across the country, which is very exciting. I'll talk a little bit about each one of these 3 points. I'm going to flesh each one of these out a little bit. And thirdly, we're getting broad support from not just scientists, but also sportsmen, recreationalists, and conservationists who are supporting wildlife corridors. So let me talk a little bit about each one of these points. And I want to start with a story because here you have on your slide, you should be able to see a few faces that you might recognize. Starting from right to left, we have Congressman Don Beyer. He's our lead sponsor in the House, and I'll talk a little bit more about him later in the presentation. And then in the center, we have Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico, and he is the lead in the Senate. Both Congressman Beyer is a Democrat and Senator Udall is a Democrat as well. And then going further along, we have the eminent scientist, Dr. Edward O. Wilson, E.O. Wilson. who's become a real true scientific champ for this. And then we have Andrew Seabrook on the left, who is an NPR reporter who is chairing or coordinating or facilitating a conversation with these three folks. And when we decided to do the bill, we wanted to raise awareness of the legislation, and we brought Dr. Wilson was celebrating Half Earth Day, so we decided we would do a little event in the Capitol. And I have to say I was very, very nervous because I got the biggest room in the Capitol. It seats about 500 people. And I thought, we will never fill this room. This was a scary proposition. And I bugged a lot of my colleagues in my office saying, oh my goodness, we've got this great big room to fill. But we weren't sure if we would get 100, we weren't sure if we could get 200, we weren't sure if we would get very many at all. And we hosted this event at a time that was very, very busy at the Capitol. It was April, the Congress was in session, there was a lot going on. And we put out invitations to congressional staff, to the public, as well as to folks who work in the administration and the agencies. And we kept our fingers crossed. We hoped that we could get a lot of people that we didn't know. And Dr. Wilson had done an event with us the previous year, and there had been about 100 people. So it was very nice, but it certainly didn't fill the room. So this is what happened. We filled the room, which was quite amazing. And we counted, at the end of the day, over 400 people had come to this event. And I have to tell you, I've never been at a conservation event in the Capitol during session when there's been more than 200 people. So this is an absolute, was sort of a signal that said, the public is hungry, members of Congress are hungry. This is something that we absolutely need to do. So let me talk a little bit about the bipartisan support for the legislation, and I want to highlight some of the efforts that have been going around the country in both in the West and the East. In the western part of the country, we've had in 2007 the Western Governors Association took on wildlife corridors, and this was largely led by Western states, Montana and Wyoming and California and others. But 16 Western states put together a very ambitious framework for protecting wildlife corridors that still continues to this day. So the Western governors have been working on this for a while. And then in 2016, the Eastern governors and Eastern Canadian premiers also came together around a resolution that recognized the importance of ecological connectivity. So we are seeing this coming from the bottom up, from the states up as well, and particularly in states that you wouldn't necessarily expect. Here's some states that have already passed wildlife corridor bills, and I want to highlight that of the 4 that are on there, you'll see that only California is really one of those true blue states. New Mexico, New Hampshire, and Wyoming last year have all passed wildlife corridor legislation. And it was particularly interesting that the effort in Wyoming was led by a very avid group of mule deer sportsmen. So we're seeing sportsmen and hunters, particularly out west, get very, very excited about the idea of protecting wildlife corridors. And then the Trump administration. Many of you may not be aware, but the Trump administration, despite the fact that it has not been great on conservation in a whole lot of ways, has actually been taking a leadership role on the protection of wildlife corridors. Just recently, or a little while ago, the Secretary Zinke issued a secretarial order to protect habitat for big game winter range and migration corridors in the West. So there's a number of states that fall under that. You can see them listed here. And his vision is really more of protecting migration corridors for game species, but he's also talked about expanding this vision to include other species and also to expand it to include the rest of the country. And we went to his office a few months ago to speak to the staff who are working with Secretary Zinke on wildlife corridors. And here you can see one of this picture is of the offices within the Secretary's office. So he has a sort of rabbit's warren of offices around his office. And to show you what a priority he has placed on this, they have over all the interior lintels of the doors around the Secretary's office, they labeled those doors migration corridors. So we took a picture of one of Zinke's staff who is migrating through his office. But this is truly a huge priority for even the Trump administration. So I also want to just highlight that we have a lot of conservation groups who have come around this effort. And now well over 75 groups have joined with us in protecting and supporting the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. Some of the leaders who have been really working with us shoulder to shoulder on Capitol Hill have been the Endangered Species Coalition, Defenders of Wildlife, National Wildlife Federation, and they've done a great job, as well as some of these other, I should absolutely have to highlight Center for Large Landscape Conservation, of course, one of the first groups that really helped in the birth of this legislation. So they've all been very active, but then a whole range of other groups, little groups and big groups from around the country have been supportive and working with us. So I wanted to introduce you to the sponsors of this legislation. And we have in the House, Congressman Don Beyer. He's the Democrat from Virginia, from Arlington, Virginia. And he is an absolutely fabulous leader and champion. I can't think of someone who is better to lead this effort in the House. He is someone who came from the business world. He was came from an automobile company background. His family owns automobile dealerships in and around Washington, D.C. But he has been the ambassador to Switzerland. He is an avid hiker. And here he is. I want to show you a brief video. He's being interviewed by John Davis on the Adirondack Trail, where he met John Davis to talk about the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And hopefully this technology will work. So I'm going to let Congressman Beyer tell you a little bit about why he thinks the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is so important.
Tell us a little bit about the politics of the Wildlife Corridors bill.
Don, I think it's getting better and better. Most people in both parties are very proud of the incredible success of the Endangered Species Act. 99% of the species that are listed since the beginning, I think it was early 70s, have recovered really significantly. These are, in many cases, vastly beating scientists' expectations of how species will recover. But now we have to be really concerned about genetic diversity. We're all upset by the notion that something like half of the animals that were alive on the planet in 1973 have disappeared because of a loss of habitat and a loss of connectivity. Everybody loves their animals. And increasingly too, John, on the Republican side, which is the more conservative side, they love to hunt and fish. And as the science of these keystone predators becomes ever more accepted, that we need to have higher level predators there in order to keep everybody else healthy in an ecosystem that works together. We just learned the other day, for example, that the disappearance of some of these predators has led to the explosion of Lyme disease, because the predators were eating the small, white-footed mice, and these mice are the carriers of the fleas that, or the ticks rather, that can give us Lyme disease. So it is a real public health problem not to have the predators there. So Wildlife Corridors is going to make Americans much healthier.
So that's Congressman Beyer, and I hope if you want to see a little bit more of him, I think we have some more videos of him on our website. But he's been an amazing champion, and he sits on the House Natural Resources Committee, which is the committee through which this legislation would pass. So as you all probably remember from how a bill becomes a law, it's going to start with the committee process. And he reached out to his colleague on the House Natural Resources Committee to co-sponsor the legislation with him. And that colleague is a Republican, Representative Garrett Graves from the Baton Rouge area of Louisiana. And Representative Graves himself he's a sportsman. He's someone who has a real love of the environment, as well as some expertise in that area. He was very involved in some of the restoration work after the oil spill, the BP oil spill. So he's someone who brings a lot of knowledge and a lot of interest as well. And he is our Republican co-sponsor in the House right now. Now, I should say quickly that the bill has not been introduced in this session of Congress. So we're waiting for Congressman Graves to sign off on the language, and I'll talk a little bit about that process. But so he has talked about being a sponsor publicly at a number of events, but these folks have not actually signed on to the legislation as yet, but he's indicated that he will. So that's our House leadership. And then on to the Senate, where we have Senator Tom Udall. Many of you may be familiar with the Udall family and Senator Udall of New Mexico. He's been a great champion of the environment, particularly the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, endangered species, and a whole suite of wilderness and lands conservation efforts that he's been involved with. He also sits on the powerful Appropriations Committee and is the senior senator. So another great champion. He's been extraordinarily enthusiastic, and his staff has been incredibly helpful. So he is our lead sponsor in the Senate. At this time, we don't have a Republican, but we are actively looking for that, and we'll get to that a little bit later in terms of what you all can do. But he is reaching out to Republicans, and like Congressman Beyer, is committed to making this bill bipartisan as well as bicameral. So we'll have both a House and a Senate version, as well as Republicans and Democrats supporting the legislation. That is certainly the hope. And then I want to talk a little bit about our scientific champion, Dr. E.O. Wilson, because he has been such an unflagging support for the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And when he came out with his book, Half Earth, last year, now maybe 2 years ago, he indicated, or he acknowledged that the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would be the greatest single step in protecting half Earth at a policy level that we can do right now in the United States. And he's been extraordinarily helpful in reaching out to other scientists and spreading the word about the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And here you can see he was being interviewed for National Public Radio, and has been doing media and work for us on this legislation. So it's just an extraordinary person, but we're so honored that he's supporting the legislation as well. And I just wanted to take you a little bit behind the scenes, as Tracy was saying, into the halls of Congress to show you a little bit of the work that we've been doing. We've certainly taken this bill out and driven it around the Hill. A lot of that is meeting with members of Congress and senators. Here you can see Senator Markey from Massachusetts in the middle, and you might recognize Senator Chris Coons of Delaware. He's been much in the news around the Russia investigations. He's on the, I believe, on the Foreign Relations Committee and other committees that have been getting a lot of play on the news. But Senator Chris Coons actually traveled to Gorongosa Park in Africa, where he looked at wildlife corridors that protected elephants. So he had a personal interest in as well. And so we're finding, as we travel around the Hill, that many members of Congress, that this bill is resonating with them in interesting and different ways. And here I just couldn't, I had to put in a slide where I sort of showed myself and all of us in our natural habitat working the corridors as we do in the Hill. Again, we've been really having a great reception for the bill, and you can see a little bit about what it looks like in a habitat that's not quite as elegant or beautiful as what the wildlife has, but is so important to protecting or to passing legislation right now. So this is where I spend my time, and I'm very excited to be doing it. All right, and then just more recently, I wanted to just highlight that there was an event just last month, and this was an event here in DC about the Attacks on the Endangered Species Act. And again, it really highlighted to me why the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act is so important, because you can see both Senator Udall and Congressman Beyer there in that group of members of Congress. You also see Raul Grijalva and Debbie Dingell, and I think Senator Carper back there. But both Representative Beyer and Senator Udall, when they came up there to defend the Endangered Species Act, both of them talked about the importance of protecting wildlife corridors, and both of them talked about this bill. And I think, again, it comes down to the need for that proactive. As we defend what we have, we need to be visionary about where we're going, and inspire people to think that we can continue to protect wildlife and move forward on a policy level. So. All right, so let me talk a little bit about the bill itself. As I said, the National Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would create a system of wildlife corridors. And this would apply to not just the terrestrial species that we think of, like pronghorn and mule deer, but also to a whole range of species, including fish and wildlife and plant species. And if you have to think of maybe an analogous model, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was in part some of the inspiration for the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. Here we have a system of rivers that has been designated over time, and it's a very impressive, started small, but now it's grown over the years to create this national system. And that's at least in part what we envision for the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And, you know, we already do have a wildlife corridor. In fact, the Path of the Pronghorn in Wyoming is our only designated wildlife corridor right now. And this wildlife corridor is designated as part of a forest plan for this, what is one of the longest terrestrial migrations in North America, and one of the most endangered. The pronghorn, as you can see from the map, they go from their summer range up to their winter range, and they go through this area called the funnel, which is in certain parts only 100 yards wide. So this was an area that people didn't know was important for migration. Then they radio collared a number of these pronghorn, found out where they were going, and realized that indeed, if they lose these key connections, that they will lose this migration. And in fact, it's interesting, but pronghorn, if you cut their migration off, they don't sort of go around and find other routes. They just stop migrating. These migratory routes are learned over generations and millennia, many years, and they're not that flexible as a species. So it's critical that we support the wildlife corridors. And this is again sort of an example of what we're envisioning as part of the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. Some of the other highlights of the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act are that the designated corridors would occur only on federal public land. So we're talking about BLM lands or Forest Service lands, or potentially Department of Defense, which is covered in here, and other federal lands. It's very important to highlight that there is coordination between not just the federal departments, but also states, tribes, local governments, NGOs, and private landowners. So we have created a system, or there's a system in the legislation that really envisions a lot of dialogue, a lot of discussion, and a lot of integration among these agencies and other federal bodies and state bodies, as well as the people who live in that landscape, the private landowners. The bill also promotes public safety, particularly where wildlife corridors cross roadways, and it requires that it encourages the Department of Transportation to work with key wildlife agencies when they are building roads to mitigate those roads. It provides incentives for private land. So as I know you all have seen those large maps, a lot of the land that we're talking about is federal public land, but there are lots of lands that we need for wildlife corridors that are in private hands. And we know that we need to encourage private landowners to try to protect lands for wildlife migration and movement. And it uses funds from the Farm Bill, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and other funds could be used to incentivize protection of wildlife corridors on private lands and state lands. And finally, the last part of the bill that I want to highlight is the wildlife, the native species habitat and corridors database. So this would be a widely shared public database that would have the most up-to-date science, so that both the federal government can plan for wildlife corridors, but also states and regions and private entities can utilize this database and can also plan for protection of wildlife corridors. So let me just go through quickly some of the species that would be protected by the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. Of course, the pronghorn that we've just spoken about, and species like the mule deer that Secretary Zinke and others are working on in their secretarial order, would be flagship species of this legislation, no doubt. But there's a whole range of other species that would be protected by the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. Here we can see the Florida Wildlife Corridor initiative, and Florida has just been leaps and bounds ahead of most states on protecting and identifying wildlife corridors. And the female panther on your screen, you can see this was a camera trap photo that was taken after she crossed the Calahoosahatchee River, which has been a northern barrier to panther movement across the Florida wildlife, Florida. And so we're very hopeful that if we have legislation, again, that we can get the resources and the protection and that species like the panther will need to move further north and to increase their range. Also, grizzly bears, of course, another flagship species, but as many of you know, there are 6 populations of grizzlies now in North America, in the US, and those populations are not connected up. So we need to build those connections and build those corridors, and the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act can help with that. And monarch migration, of course, if you have kids, they probably did a monarch project in their school, but this is a species that we know is in trouble, that needs to move across the landscape. And with resources from the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act through the Farm Bill and other places, we can really envision that happening. I'll also just highlight one of our species that we're working on in our Southeast office, the elk that are coming back to the Smoky Mountains. They need funding. There needs to be more funding and more protection for them to cross the I-40 corridor outside of the Smoky Mountain National Park. So again, that's something that the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act could help with. And finally, looking at a marine species, the northern right whale, a really, really endangered species, but that moves over a vast distance, and entanglement and other impediments to that migration are something that we really think that the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act could help with. So let me talk just really briefly about the plans for Congress in this session and then up into the future. So for this year, we are planning on introducing the bill, probably with some tweaks and changes to what it was introduced in the last session of Congress, sometime during the lame duck session. Right now, we're looking at likely the week of November 12th, I believe, for an introduction. But the hope is sometime during this lame duck session that there'll be introduction in both the House and the Senate. But in 2019 is where things get really exciting, because we'll have a new Congress, hopefully a better Congress. And this is the time when there are a lot more opportunities, both for bipartisanship, but also for legislation. The first 6 months of a new Congress is really like the fertile ground for when things take off. And the good news is that we are ready with a bill. We're ready to hit that fertile ground running. And our hope is that we will do a lot of public education and outreach to get a number of sponsors, Democrats and Republicans, so that we can move the bill and move it through the committee process with a healthy amount of bipartisan support in 2019. And to that end, we're planning on mounting a national public education and organizing campaign, really growing our coalition and bringing people, particularly from those key red states that we need to get support to make this bill bipartisan, bringing them to Washington, D.C., continuing to do the kind of scientific briefings that we've been doing, and organizing in key communities around the country to get support for the legislation. And I just want to say very quickly that there are a number of other states that we know that are planning on wildlife corridor bills in 2019 as well. And here are the few that are highlighted. If your state is one of those, please contact your state legislator and let them know that you support wildlife corridors. It's extremely exciting that we're seeing this coming not just from Washington, D.C., but also from around the country, and again, in states that are not necessarily blue or even purple. So we've got some pretty red states in there in that mix too. So very, very exciting. And as I was saying, again, the state legislation is exciting in Virginia. I'm working specifically on that legislation, and I wanted to use this to sort of pivot to the "we need your help." This photo was taken at a meeting where we had 30 conservation groups that got very excited about working on wildlife corridor conservation and introducing a bill in the January session of the Virginia legislature. But looking at that owl bear and his plea for your help, I'm going to turn you to what you can do to support wildlife corridors legislation. First of all, we are, again, so excited that you're interested in this issue, but we do need your help, absolutely. And we want you, if you can, to reach out to your member of Congress and your senator to support the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And we've given you a few ways that you can do that. Of course, we also are interested in supporting the state bills as well, and we'll have information on our website about that. And finally, we hope that you vote wisely in November and ask candidates what they're doing to protect wildlife corridors. Keep this issue out there, because we know that when members of Congress and the public hear about the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, they get interested, they get hopeful, they get inspired. So we just need you to get the message out. And finally, I'll just leave you with the words of our scientific champion, Dr. E.O. Wilson. And that the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would provide the most important step at the present time in enlarging the nation's protected areas and saving America's wildlife and other flora and fauna. And I just want to thank you all again for being interested in this bill, and hope that you have some questions and we can engage in a little bit of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was great, a really inspiring presentation. I'm going to go ahead and read some of the questions that have come in for you. We have our first question is from Anna Pepper. She's asking, will this webinar be available to listen to later? And Anna, I'll go ahead and take that for you. Yes, we will send a link out with this presentation to everyone who registered in a day or two. This one's from Andrew Laskin. Hi, Andy. He's asking, Susan, can you please explain a little bit more about the incentives for private land? Would it be payments to landowners who place conservation easements on their land?
Right, exactly. So what this bill envisions right now is that through the existing Farm Bill program, so if you're familiar with the wetlands restoration programs or the WIP, some of the various different conservation programs in the CRP and the Farm Bill, that there would be specific funds for wildlife corridor protection. So you, in the case of the Farm Bill, you would go through those existing programs, but though they would be there would be Farm Bill funds specifically for wildlife corridors. In the case of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, again, it would be using those funds, but specifically for wildlife corridors. And then there's also actually, which I didn't highlight, but within the bill, there's actually dedicated funding that could be used for private land conservation. And the bill envisions a strategy where a process would be developed, but it doesn't actually develop that process yet. So, but there would be at least 3 major sources of funding, from the Farm Bill to the Land and Water Conservation Fund to the funding through the bill program. And you would, at least in the case of LWCF and the Farm Bill programs, you'd utilize the existing programs and follow those procedures, but for wildlife corridors.
Okay, thank you, Susan. The next question is from Joe Hickson. Joe is asking, she'd like a digital large-scale image of the Eastern Wildway in Georgia and South Carolina, and can we send her a link to that?
Yeah, I think Ron could do that. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think so, Joe. I will make sure that we get with Ron Sutherland, who's on this webinar, by the way. And Ron, if you're listening, can you help Joe with that? Otherwise, we'll reach out and facilitate that for you. The next question is from Rob Smith. And Rob is asking, how should we answer concerns about imposing new layers of restrictions on land use? For instance, will this potentially limit grazing, mining, ORV use, and logging?
Right. So the way that the bill would work is as agencies are planning in their, so in the case of the forest planning, if you're going through your forest plan or BLM planning, that the agencies going through that normal planning process would be able to incorporate wildlife corridor protection into those plans. So it would be sort of the same issues as with any planning. In the case of grazing or mining, the way that the bill envisions this would work is wildlife corridors would be protected for the species for which that wildlife corridor is designated. So for example, if you're designating a corridor for the pronghorn, you would have to look at where the pronghorn moves and what would be the impediments to that movement and could impact the habitat. So certain things might be wholly compatible, for example, hunting or fishing or potentially grazing in the case of pronghorn, but there may be other things like potentially oil and gas development that would impinge upon that migration. So each designated corridor would be managed for that species for which it is designated, and any restrictions would be through the forest plan or the agency planning process, and it would be limited to the restrictions that would impact the corridor. So it really depends on what species and where you're talking about.
Thanks, Susan. Nike Lewis is asking, does your public education campaign include specific materials for schools?
Not yet. That's a great idea, though. I love that idea. We do have quite a few materials on our website right now. We have fact sheets that talk about how the Act would protect certain species, and as well as sort of an overview of the bill. But I think it's a great idea. Certainly, we have limited resources, so we're actually at the point where we're trying to raise a little bit more resources for our larger and more expanded and ambitious campaign next year, and that's the kind of thing that would be a great thing to think about.
And Matt Clark, another familiar face. Hi, Matt, or name. Good to have you with us today. Matt's asking, will the bill also specifically include mitigation efforts across railways as well as roads and unnatural barriers to aquatic life?
So yes, right now the bill does have, let me start with aquatic life. The bill, one of the covered agencies is NOAA, and the bill actually mentions things like dams and other blockages or impediments to movement in river systems. So we are aware definitely of trying to do that through the bill, and yes, the idea is, again, let's say if you were having a wildlife corridor that would be designated for salmon, you would look at a whole range of things that could impact the salmon, including, cutting along the riparian areas, potentially dam mitigation, those kinds of things. Back to the first question. What was the first part of that, Tracy? Remind me.
Mitigation efforts across railways as well as
railways. Okay. Yeah, so Department of Transportation is also mentioned in this bill, and that's a good question. I'm not as familiar with how the DOT interacts with rail as I am with roads, and so I'd certainly be happy to follow up with you on rail specifically. In general, when new roads are being built or roads are being modified, the bill directs that DOT looks at ways to mitigate for wildlife and looks at road crossings. But I think rail is a really interesting question that I'd love to maybe dig a little more into.
Yeah, that is a good question. Thanks, Matt. Larry Master, hi there. Do you anticipate any opposition, Susan, organized or otherwise, to the bill?
Well, I wish I could say no, it's going to be great. I think certainly we haven't seen, outright opposition. I think what we've seen are the same kinds of questions that always get raised by any effort to protect, the land and conserve land, particularly at the scale at which we're talking about. I mean, one of the things that is exciting is that this bill is ambitious, and it does, sort of like we have a lot of big conservation laws, the Endangered Species Act and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and this bill is, I sort of think of it as in the next generation of conservation laws that we need to have on the books. What we have seen certainly are folks from the private landowners and sporting community kind of raising questions about how would this impact our lands, how would this impact hunting and fishing, and we've tried to address those. And in fact, what we're going through right now is a process where we've taken a lot of input from folks from the states as well as from the sporting and hunting community, and we're trying to address concerns that they have at the front end before we reintroduce it in the lame duck session. So my hope is that we can try to address these concerns about, federal land grabs and overreach and all of that in a proactive way, and that we can have bipartisan support. But I anticipate that there's always going to be a few people that are not thrilled with conserving more land.
Okay. Mark Berman, hi Mark. He's asking, Susan, have you considered utilizing David Quammen's book, The Song of the Dodo, as an introductory and educational tool for the importance of wildlife corridors? He says that he's found it to provide an impelling message, and was his original introduction to Wildlands Network when it was first published. And Mark is a longtime donor of Wildlands Network. from that time, yeah.
No, I love that idea, and I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I think we should reach out to David Quammen and maybe get him involved in this, just as E.O. Wilson has been involved and been so instrumental. It would be wonderful to get his engagement. I mean, I love that book, and I think it's a brilliant idea, and I'd love to follow up on that.
And we have one last question from Matt Burke. Hi, Matt. He's saying thank you, and he says he's a big supporter of Wildlands Network, and he appreciates the effort and ambition, Susan. On the policy, does the legislation specify management criteria? Does the legislation specify coordination with Canada and Mexico, and what's the support there? And on the politics, does the plan specify the need to work closely with First Nations and Indigenous communities?
Yes. Okay. Let me take, how do I want to do this? I'll take it from the international first. Yes, the bill does cover international and across borders. So we do have an international component to this. Obviously, Wildlands Network is committed to that international vision, and it's wonderful that the bill reflects that. So both, reaching across the borders. So that is an element of the bill. Oh my gosh, Tracy, you're going to have to, tribal. So tribal knowledge is part of the bill. So we do have a language specifically related to traditional knowledge. But I will say that this is one of the things that we're actively doing right now. We're reaching out to tribes and engaging with them, or trying to do more of that. It's not something that we did very much at the very beginning of this, I will admit, and I think it's something that we need to do more of. So we've begun that process and are eager to partner with folks if they have relationships or want to highlight that for us. But I do think that's something that I think a lot of the folks who we have spoken to have been very excited about it, but I think we could certainly do more. So on the politics, what was the first part of the question? So, is it prescriptive? So again, how the bill would work is that the bill would designate corridors for specific species. So it doesn't prescribe certain management regimes for those, because the species would vary, right? So it doesn't say you can't hunt, or you can't fish, or you can't mine, or you can't log, or whatever. What it does say is that the corridor must be managed consistent with protecting that corridor for that species. So it has a lot of flexibility in terms of what you can and you can't do, based on what the corridor, the needs of that wildlife corridor and the species would be. I hope that answered the question.
I think so. I think that was good. And that is the last question. I think, did we get one more just now? No, that is that. So we can start to wrap this up. I have to say that what strikes me the most about this presentation, Susan, is that you're a one person shop in Washington, D.C., who's single-handedly stewarding these impressive national policy efforts on the Hill. It's very impressive, and I loved learning more about this. We've always been a very lean organization, and together with all of these brilliant and well-known national organizations and groups that are working with us and following your lead, the quest for national corridor legislation is actually moving forward. And if you stop and think about that, it's during a time of incredible, unprecedented divisiveness. And I just am really proud to be able to brag about that to our supporters, colleagues, and friends, and the people who are joining us today on this webinar. It's really quite an achievement, and I'd like to thank you for all of your hard work on this. I'd also like to thank again our friends and colleagues who have been working with Susan and Wildlands Network on this national policy. The House and Senate sponsors on Capitol Hill. This great work would not happen with any of the people that are working collaboratively on this. And a huge heartfelt call out to Ruth Musgrave with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators and the Endangered Species Coalition, National Wildlife Federation, Center for Large Landscape Conservation, and Defenders of Wildlife, and all of the people out in our Seattle office who are working doggedly on the state legislative efforts. This stuff is really great, and I'm really proud to be a small part of it. Last but not least, I'd love to thank all of you who joined us today and our donors who support our vision and our mission. Thank you for bringing your passion and your resources to Wildlands Network. Remember, if you want to get involved, you can ask your members of Congress to support the bill, and you can contact your state wildlife officials for the handful of bills that are going to be introduced next year that Susan told you about. Vote wisely in November and donate if you can. This is a big bill. This is exciting. It's ambitious, but we need huge resources to get it through Congress. We'll need significant support for the public education portion of the national campaign, and we would appreciate if you can dig a little deeper this year and help support this inspiring effort. Feel free to reach out to Susan if you want any more information. If you'd like to make a donation or talk about giving plans for this year or next, you can reach out to me. Our information will be in the follow-up email that you receive, and so will a link to this recording. We invite you to share it with your friends and colleagues, anyone who might want to learn more about Susan's work on Capitol Hill. And that's about it from me. This was great. I really appreciate your time, Susan, and everybody who joined us today. Have a great afternoon and rest of your week.